Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. Transit is something that I'm really quite passionate about. I'm chairman of a civic advocacy organization in Toronto called Transit Alliance. I've been involved in transit issues with the Mississauga Summit. And my kids always laugh when I say I'm passionate about infrastructure, but I truly am, because I think it is the oil, the grease that gets social mobility going, gets mobility within business going. It gets ideas going. It is what makes a city a great city. There was this fantastic book called The Triumph of a City by a gentleman by the name of Ed Glazer, a professor at Harvard University, that described how the metabolism of a city increased over time as its mass went up. However, the linear regression of the track between increase in size and increase in metabolism, and he defined increased metabolism as higher incomes, greater wealth, more innovation, more patents, etc., was broken by cities that had either really good transit, i.e. London, England, or Paris, France, and really bad transit, and the example being some cities in India and China that he used that didn't have great transit. So transit is key for us getting around, which makes sense if a city is this incredible dynamic economic structure and social structure, because it's an agglomeration of people that are all together. Then very clearly, we got to be able to get around, to meet those other people, to trade with those other people, to interact with those other people, to go to university with those other people, to start businesses with those other people, or otherwise, why be involved in a big city? We might as well just all be spread out. So transit, I think, is the key. And a gentleman that I think quite highly of suggested that he should come on my show and talk about the role that he's played in transit. And I've met him on numerous occasions through Transit Alliance and some other efforts. And he's a really smart guy and an interesting guy and an articulate guy. So I want to introduce you to Sanathan Kassiedass, also known to me and other people as San. He's recently wrapped up a contract leading innovation and new mobility for Metrolinx, the transit authority for the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area and the Greater Golden Horseshoe. It's interesting that his intersection, his work has really been at the intersection of technology, planning, and innovation. He's got experience in transportation with the City of Hamilton and Metrolinx. He's also done innovation practices with Overlap Associates, a human-centered design consulting firm in the Waterloo region. And he's previously also managed a product concept group with BlackBerry for nearly a decade. He's got a Master's of Urban Planning from the University of Waterloo and a business degree in IT management from Ryerson University. He volunteers for numerous organizations, including Transit Alliance. So, San, welcome to my show. How are you doing?
Doing well. Thanks for having me. Really looking forward to a fun conversation here.
Fantastic. So let's start off. What is new mobility?
Sure. So it's an interesting term that covers a wide portfolio of services. Often these services are accessed via an app on your mobile phone, your smartphone, but I wouldn't say that that's a definitive feature. It's just sort of a commonality. We're talking about things like car share, ride share, bike share, on-demand transit, which is sort of like bringing the Uber or Lyft-like experience into the transit service, a term we call mobility as a service, and into the future, autonomous vehicles. So it's a wide range of services that helps connect transit to the broader community.
So is new mobility a competitor to transit or a complementary service to transit?
I would say complementary. Often these suite of services are talked about in what we call first and last mile. So how do you get to that local train station or to that bus stop? Bridging that last little gap.
I've prior to COVID-19, so not during the pandemic, but prior to COVID-19, I got in the habit of taking an Uber to the local GO train station. It was during the winter. It was far more convenient because I got dropped off right at the station rather than having to park or hunt for a parking spot in the parking lot and then walk, I'm going to exaggerate and say a kilometer, but it was a long way often to get to the train station through snow and rain and whatnot. And I got to tell you, I got probably 3 or 4 tickets because the parking lot was often full, and I parked probably in an inappropriate spot that I thought was appropriate, but someone else thought was inappropriate. And then often, after work, maybe I'd go out for a drink, or I'd go to a hockey game and have a drink, or I'd go out to some event, and I didn't want to drive home. And so therefore, the combination of the Uber and transit, the GO train, was perfect for me. And that's what you're saying, the last mile, the first mile, right?
Exactly. Now, of course, there's sort of an affordability issue. So if someone is traveling on a daily basis, less likely that they're going to take an Uber every single day in comparison to sort of maybe a $3 transit trip. But there are a number of people for whom they live, the way I describe it, they live out in the periphery of Toronto in the 905 region, and they may see a transit vehicle going by, but for them it might as well be a UPS van, because it's just not a service they really see designed for them. And so these
bus routes often take a meandering route all through suburbia. So for me, when I at least valued my time, I didn't want to take a bus that would meander all through. I wanted to take the ride straight to the GO train station.
Yeah, and in future, hopefully it's not just you. Hopefully we can have more than one person in that vehicle getting to that.
So it's going to be a shared vehicle, last mile kind of solution.
Ideally. Now that term on-demand transit, Uber and Lyft are in what we call TNCs, transportation network companies, or ride shares. And they are one type of service provider that can help with delivering on demand, but there's a wide suite of vendors available that have different service models and business models, including allowing transit agencies to use their own vehicles and their own staff in providing the service.
We're chatting tonight with Kassiedass, a transit expert, and we're going to take a break for some messages and come back more with San in just a minute and talk a little bit about Metrolinx and his experience working there. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. We're talking transit tonight with Kassiedass, a gentleman that's just finished a contract with Metrolinx. He's got an urban planning background as well as a business degree in IT management. Very smart guy. And we just talked about what new mobility is. But let's take a step back, if we could, San. Metrolinx, why do we need a regional transit authority like Metrolinx? Why can't each one of the different cities do it on their own?
You mean in terms of getting involved with new mobility type services?
No, just transit in general.
I think a lot of it has to do with coordination. So most people who live in one municipality in this region don't necessarily work in the same municipality. So you need some help in coordinating the services between the different boundaries.
Okay. So we've got this regional transit authority that goes to cross boundaries, and it's primarily GO Transit, primarily trains, but also buses. So why does it need to have an innovation team?
Interesting question. So we have this thing that we call the 5 Whys. It's like a workshop tool, innovation tool that helps you get to sort of the meat and matter. And the primary reason, you ask someone, well, why would you want some of these services? Why would you want on-demand transit or an autonomous service? And it's primarily about station access. So you can look online. Metrolinx has this thing we call a station access plan, 2031 station access plan. And by that date, in about 10 years, we're expecting nearly 1 in 10 people to come to the stations via on-demand transit, for the same reasons you were talking about earlier, right? The convenience, and the parking lots are full, and how else can you get people to the station? But why do we care about that? So why do we care about people who need to get to the station perhaps midday or off peak or that type of thing? And it's about getting the bums on the seats, filling those trains, right? We're getting to a point where eventually we're going to have 2-way, 15-minute, all-day GO rail service. And there's no point running that service if there's nobody on it, so you need people on it. And then why do we care about that? Transit is often a major tool in mitigating traffic congestion, which of course leads to economic prosperity that you were referring to in the opening there. And of course, municipalities have other trip purposes that they need to feed, not just the GO rail station. But the definition of transit is changing, right? It's not just about buses and trains. It is about moving masses of people. And so we have so many more tools available to us today that we should be exploring.
Such as?
Well, such as these on-demand transit services we're referring to, where you can have someone have an app on their phone and connect them to a ride to help get them to transit. And getting people to those stations helps us de-risk these investments, right? We're investing billions of dollars into these large-scale transit projects, and we need to ensure people can get to the stations in order to get the ROI on those investments.
What about bikes? What about walking?
All needed. About 60% of people that are getting to the stations live within 5 kilometers, so there's a significant portion that could probably bike. And there's
Sorry, that's interesting. 60% of the people that take GO Transit live within 5 kilometers of the train station.
Yes.
That's certainly, at least in good weather, bikeable.
At least 2 kilometers in a comfortable manner. And at my previous house where I lived, we were within 2 kilometers, and I biked most days. But a lot of this is also about behavior change. So you're not going to get someone.
At my local GO train station, I think there's 1 bike rack.
There's a number of bike racks in a lot of stations. One of the concerns historically has been bike theft.
Yep.
And so, there's certainly movement towards adding more secure bike rooms and adding more security that helps with that. And then there's also partnerships with local municipalities to ensure that you don't have the bike lane that goes nowhere, but you have the connected network. So yeah, definitely, it's not just about any one mode. It is about getting to a range of modes. And if you pull up that station access plan, it flips the hierarchy upside down. So instead of today you having the majority of people arriving via cars, the priority is putting pedestrians first, cyclists next, transit, carpooling, etc. So that you have these more sustainable modes as the primary focus of getting to those stations.
I think about Port Credit or Oakville or Clarkson or a bunch of the GO train stations that I think of, Arundel, etc. There should be lots of people that would be interested in biking to those stations.
And if you visit some of them, a lot of these stations, I did a study a couple of years ago and took a bunch of pictures. Even in colder weather, it was like November, and there were quite a number of bikes that are at the stations. So there's a lot of work to build openness and receptiveness to biking to the stations, and it doesn't happen overnight. I think that there's lots of work to be done there.
So bike lanes, bike racks, bike rooms, etc., would all be helpful to that. What about your other last mile solutions like Ubers and Lyfts and shared vehicles and autonomous vehicles and things like that? What are the things you do to make it easier for those vehicles to get to the stations?
There's lots of things that can be experimented with. If you notice, leaving the station is a big problem. At night, just the traffic jam of vehicles all leaving at the same time. So I think there are some experiments that can be had in terms of HOV lanes to sort of prioritize the higher occupant vehicles, the buses, anybody who's carpooled into the station, any of these shared ride services. There could be some experimentation there to prioritize that access. And many pilots, you touched on autonomous vehicles. Obviously, that's not a sort of next year solution, but there's pilot projects happening in that realm as well. So out in Scarborough, there will be a pilot project between the City of Toronto, TTC and Metrolinx testing an autonomous shuttle.
So I was involved in a real estate development project where we had typically designed just big parking spaces. And it was interesting because we had this innovation consultant come and said, you guys are designing this thing for the 1990s or the 2000s, not the 2020s or the 2030s. Because what you're going to do is not have a whole bunch of cars come and park. What you're going to do is you're going to have thousands of autonomous vehicles come and drop people off. And so therefore what you got to do is you got to design the mother of all kiss and rides, and you got to separate it from the rest of the cars, and you got to be able to get those cars in and out quickly. Otherwise, they're just going to be idling for a long period of time. What do you think we need to do at GO trains and subways to allow autonomous vehicles to come in and drop off and pick up people? or nothing. And, I'll give you one example. I was in the San Francisco airport, which is probably the center of a lot of these drive share places. They had, I think, on the top roof of the structured parking lot, 4 different kiss and rides for different shared vehicle ownership companies. And it was incredibly efficient, rather than at Pearson, where you go downstairs and it's just, luck if you find your guy in a, they're coming up and you always have to wait, versus in San Francisco, you never had to wait.
Yeah, and I think you touched on the key there. It is definitely about the kiss and ride, about that Papudo space, the passenger pickup drop-off area. And because it's ambiguous, right? We have no idea if true autonomous vehicles are within single-digit years away or decades away.
What's your bet?
My bet, 20, 30 years.
Really? Long time. Okay.
Yeah. But even that, in the grand scheme of real estate development, is not necessarily that long, right? Like buildings last much longer than that. What we want to do, though, is not block ourselves off, right? You don't want to be putting a building there that's designed to last for 100+ years in the way when you may need that space for more passenger pickup drop-off, kiss and ride type activity. So certainly just allowing for the space, so not blocking ourselves off, allowing for growth in that Papudo space, whether it's any of our transit type stations, and further experimentation with the kiss and ride, and figuring out how do you make that a more efficient space and matching the customers to the vehicles, whether it's human driven today or at some point in the future, sort of a robo-taxi service.
You mentioned some pilot out east. What sort of autonomous shuttle pilots are being worked on right now?
So this is there's sort of a class of vehicle that serves this. It's autonomous vehicles that are designed for the transit service, and they hold 6 to 12 passengers, and they are sort of that first mile, last mile circuit. They'll go in around handful of kilometers, 1, 2, 3, 4 kilometers, near a station. And so they'll be testing that at one of the standard vendors out there that have emerged in this class. But it's definitely early days. And if you compare what I would describe as the sedan market, the Waymos, GMs of the world, and the sector that's supplying autonomous vehicles for the transit sector, there's definitely a gap in terms of capability of those vehicles. And I think it's important for the public sector to be investing in these transit vehicles to ensure that they get there, support these types of vendors. And along those lines, one of the key things that is important in these tests is to give the public exposure to the vehicles. The interest and the willingness of the public to ride in an autonomous vehicle has sort of followed the Gartner hype cycle. So when we
what cycle?
The Gartner hype cycle.
Tell us about the Gartner hype cycle.
Well, so it's like, at the start, when we started hearing about autonomous vehicles a few years ago, everyone was so excited, right? We thought this is going to solve all the world's problems. Congestion's going to go away. We're never going to have any more accidents. The vehicles are going to travel super close together, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, we figured out the solution to congestion.
Well, that was what they were pitched as, right?
No, regrettably, we found out the solution to congestion is have a pandemic. I've been driving downtown a few times, and regrettably, it's not funny. It's like, it's not. I've been driving downtown a few times. You can zoom downtown the Gardiner Expressway or the Don Valley Parkway in no time flat.
Yeah.
No one's going to work. At least no one's going to work downtown.
Well, it's been a great experiment in telework. So we finally proved to each other that we can do this. We can meet online.
Works.
Yeah.
I think it works for a while. I'm not sure it works for forever and for long term. I think people need to have that face-to-face communication. And you just laughed and I laughed back. One of the things they're finding out is that people are missing the human connection, because when you have a Zoom meeting, it's almost all about business. You don't have the time to chat beforehand as you're walking into the boardroom, and during the break in action, and then as you're leaving, you don't know about how the guy's kids are doing or how the ladies, whatever is happening. Like, you just don't have that sort of water cooler coffee table kind of conversation. So we need to figure out a way to do that because it's difficult to do. Anyway, so you think that autonomous vehicles are 20 years, 30 years away?
Yep. I think there's going to be certain applications that we'll see much sooner, and I think transit's certainly one of them. In those sort of first mile, last mile type use cases, or an environment such as a BRT, a bus rapid transit way, where you have a segregated lane, right? There's no other humans in that lane. There's no one else driving. There's no pedestrians, no cyclists. That type of infrastructure, my view is that's where we will actually see the first autonomous vehicles, because it's a controlled environment. You can trust the AVs versus that day where you can just hop in a vehicle and start watching a movie, and it's going to avoid all the cyclists and pedestrians on the road. I think that's a bit further away.
So you were talking about this hype cycle, and so what you're saying is what? It's slow on the uptake. That's your point?
Yeah. So everyone got really excited about autonomous vehicles, and then we got into some open road testing, and incredibly unfortunate that there were a couple deaths that occurred, and because of that, the public perception dove, right? So you have a number of studies that show now about half of the public is not willing to get in an AV. They don't trust it. They don't think it's safe enough. And so if we are to ever achieve those wins where we can impact congestion and have the road safety benefits, we would actually need the public to be willing to ride in these vehicles. And so it's ever so important to bring the public along and have them experience the state of technology as it develops. We also had come up with this interesting tagline or mission statement, which was that we wanted the first ride that anyone in the GTHA is having in an autonomous vehicle, for that ride to be in a public transit vehicle or in a shared use vehicle. And the reason for that is, if autonomous vehicles do achieve that mission where you can just buy one in a private use case and start watching a movie, and it drives you to work, and then you release it and it drives home, parks in your garage, that can instantly double congestion, because you have naturally at least twice the vehicles, right? They're not only taking their work, they're driving themselves home. You have people driving much longer kilometers. And so to combat that, to get around people who will have this view that I'm just going to sit in the AV and it's going to take me everywhere I want to go, and our single-use vehicles will increase, we need a number of efforts to have the public go the opposite direction and be more comfortable with shared use vehicles. And so if people start viewing autonomous vehicles as a public transit use case and not it's going to be mine sitting in my driveway use case, I think that's important for combating congestion long term.
No question. We're going to come back and talk more about this with San in just a minute. We're going to take a break for some messages. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. We're joined tonight by a transit expert. His name is Sanathan Kassiedass. I call him San. He has worked with Metrolinx. He's worked with BlackBerry. He's got a great deal of experience. He's got a master's of urban planning. He's got a business degree in IT management from Ryerson University. And I've worked with him at Transit Alliance, a civic advocacy organization that I'm honored to be the chair of. And if you're at all interested in transit, you should check it out, transitalliance.com. Sam, we were talking about shared use of autonomous vehicles, and I guess what you're talking about is sharing them at the same time. I guess I was thinking that autonomous vehicles were going to be things that you would share at different times, and so you didn't own your autonomous vehicle, and so therefore you may not reduce the number of vehicles going to downtown Toronto, for an example, but once you had taken your trip, it would drop you off like an Uber did, and then it would go and take someone else on the trip. So what it would do is it would, number one, alleviate all the need for all these massive, huge structured parking lots. Number two, what it would do is It would, because it was autonomous and electric and it didn't crash, you could reduce the space between the vehicles on the Garden Expressway. And if you did that, I think the predictions are you could have 2 or 3 times as many vehicles travel per lane. I think right now the number is like you've got 2,000 cars per lane per mile. You could go to 6 to even more thousand cars per lane per mile. And then, frankly, what it would do is it would change the urban environment in suburbia. Because you no longer have to have garages, because the vehicle would come and pick you up in the morning and take you where you wanted to go, and you wouldn't have to have a garage. I had one guy say to me that this was going to be as big of a change to the urban fabric or the suburban fabric as going from horse-drawn carriages to cars was, because with horse-drawn carriages, we all had to have a carriage house that was separated from the house because the horses that we kept there were stinky. And then once we went to cars, we had the garage that was attached. And then, as houses became, house lots became smaller, the garage became, from 1/3 to 2/3 of the front of the house, to sometimes it's almost 7/8 of the front of the house, and you just get a little tiny room for a doorway. Then we go back to, the era of big front porches, because you no longer had to have a garage at the front of the house. That whole scenario is predicated on the autonomous vehicle not being your own personal property, it effectively being something that you share, whether it's owned by the transit authority or by, you and you rent it out to other people. I'm not sure, or whether it's owned by Uber and it's rented out to other people. But that's different than your scenario where it picks up a couple of people. I think people want to have their own private vehicle if they're going to be driving all the way downtown. What do you think?
Yeah, and I don't necessarily know if our two scenarios need to be separate. I think there's probably a combination in there where some people are traveling in a shared vehicle and some people have sort of their own private ride. When we get to that point in the future, I'd say pricing can probably start to differentiate that, right? You want the luxury of having the vehicle all to yourself, then there's probably a higher fee, and if you're willing to share, then there's probably a lower fee.
So much of our psyche in North America, at least, has been around car ownership and the type of car we drive and the status that it provides us. And, the first thing we wanted to do, at least when I was a kid, probably not when you were a kid, but when I was a kid, when we turned 16, is to get our driver's license and then buy a car. And, that car that we wanted to buy had to be fast and sexy and hot. Do you think we're going to give that up?
Over time, I think there will be a movement towards it. You hear lots of stats about younger people, millennials, et cetera, taking a long time to get their license. My youngest sister was like that, didn't get her license until she was 30. I've known several people in that sort of age group that took much longer time or still don't have a license. So that we share in terms of that excitement to have grabbed a license at 16. I don't think that excitement still exists for many. There's somewhere it does, and I don't think that that love of driving will ever go away. Perhaps at some point in the future there'll be, if it truly is an autonomous vehicle everywhere, there might be special tracks where you take your car to go and joyride because you enjoy the act of driving.
Sam, one of the things that you've been talking about is human-centered design. What is human-centered design, and how does it apply in your new services and in transit?
Yeah, so it's a product development process, somewhat similar to many others. There's a bit of plan, do, act type rhythm to it, and you can Google it. There's typically 5 or 7 steps depending on the sort of group that's pitching it. IDEO is a world famous consulting company that has utilized this method much in the early days. The original computer mouse was used to help, the process was used to help develop that product. The things that differentiate this process, though, are one, a very, very heavy emphasis on knowing the customer. And so we're not just talking about demographics, right? Not just saying, well, we skew male or female, or these are our age gaps or whatever. Putting yourself in the customer's shoes, going there, following them around, understanding why it is that they're doing things, observing them, that type of thing. And 2, the process is very iterative. So we're not talking a typical waterfall method where you plan out your service, you have a large planning time frame, then you develop it, and then you go out and launch, only then to find out that you sort of missed the mark on some things. And so in applying this, there's lots of applications in the transit space. There's a consulting company called Bridgeable that did a project a number of years ago looking at on-demand transit. And when I talk to people about on-demand in the transit space, especially when I was with Metrolinx, and you talk about Go Transit, people say, well, there's no way that's going to work because there's free parking. So why would someone ever pay you to get picked up in a different vehicle and take them to the station? So Bridgeable got together and they had a number of mocked up concepts about what this type of service could look like, and they started pitching it and talking to customers at the station. And one thing that they noticed as they're talking about it is customers would stop and sort of look to one side of their head and start comparing, well, this would be the price of a reserved parking spot for the month, and this would be the price when I add up how much I would pay for the on-demand services, how much I'd have to pay for that service. And so what we realized is the anchor point wasn't necessarily the free parking spot, but it was the reserved parking spot, because what we would be providing with on-demand transit isn't just the ride to the station, but sort of that guarantee and that comfort that, okay, I don't need to stress about parking anymore. I don't need to pay you to get my vehicle to the station. You're just going to get me there. And it's those types of insights that you can get only through this iterative activity. You can't get that sort of just in the boardroom on a whiteboard. And so I'm a big fan of using human-centered design or design thinking in all types of different projects, including transit projects.
I've heard this, is it MAS, M-A-A-S term bandied about, which is sort of like software as a service, mobility as a service. Can you explain, you're an IT guy as well, explain to us what software as a service is and how it compares to the past, and then by extrapolation, what mobility as a service is and how it compares to today.
Yeah, for sure. So software as a service simply means that you don't own the code, the application that's sitting on your machine or your device. And historically, you'd kind of go to the store and buy perhaps a CD or a DVD and install the software, and then you owned it perpetually. Nowadays, it's far more common that you're accessing the service remotely and you're paying sort of on a license monthly or a yearly basis. And there's a million examples out there. Anyone who's using a sort of a Gmail or a Hotmail, that's sort of software as a service. Our various mapping services. Most of the software you access today, if you're not downloading it, you're accessing on a web browser. Salesforce is a perfect example of software as a service. And so that model where it seems great for the...
Is Spotify music as a service? Is Netflix movies as a service?
Exactly. They're both sort of that as a service model, Spotify and Netflix. And mobility as a service is often coined as the Netflix of mobility. So it's that kind of pay one price, you get it all packaged up in one. And so mobility as a service is a concept where you would have a mobile app on your phone, and in many cases it would most likely be a subscription service where you can access the bike share, the ride share, the car share, transit, etc., all through the one device. You say, okay, I want to get from here to downtown, and perhaps there's a ride share service that picks you up and brings you to the station. And then there's you take the train down, and when you get downtown, you're connected by a bike, because that happened to be the most efficient or most cost-effective way to get you where you are. And today, that's a very fragmented experience, right? You can't plan all of that as one trip today, and it's hard to figure out how much each of those legs will cost you today.
But when I go on my GPS, it'll tell me I gotta do this as a walk, I gotta do this as a transit, I gotta do this as a walk. So the GPS is already trying to figure out the different steps.
Yeah, they'll typically get you to two modes, right? Like they'll typically say, okay, walk here and then take transit and then walk there. but very rarely will you see, okay, you can drive here, then you can take transit, and then you can walk, and then you can bike, etc. Or connecting you to the services, right? So you might get downtown, but now you have to figure out how to use the bike share service. Or if you're from out of town, now you have to figure out how to use a transit service.
So mobility as a service is what you're going to do and create, which is going to be all of that wrapped up in one app.
It's a concept that's being explored around the world, not only around the region here. So yeah, there are many players in this field.
Well, that's exciting. We're chatting tonight with San about transit. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back with some concluding comments in just a minute. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960 AM. I come to you every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock, 960 AM, or you can stream me online at www.saga960am.ca, or you can get all my podcasts and videocasts after the fact on my website, briancrombie.com. Tonight's guest is Sanathan Kassiedass, also known as San. He has just wrapped up a contract in innovation and new mobility for Metrolinx, which is the transit authority here in the GTA. He really has worked in the past on tech, on planning, on innovation. He's worked in transportation for the city of Hamilton. He's worked for Metrolinx. He's worked for Overlap Associates, and he's worked for BlackBerry, a product concept group for BlackBerry. He's got a master's in urban planning and a business degree in IT management. So he knows what he's talking about. San, you've spent a couple of years in transit with Hamilton and Metrolinx, and numerous years that I've known you through Transit Alliance, etc. What's the biggest innovation, the most exciting development from a transit standpoint that you're thinking about?
On a personal level, there's obviously a million great ideas out there. One of the biggest ones for me in the long term is not necessarily directly related to transit per se, but it's this term that we call road pricing. And it's the idea that people will pay for every single kilometer they drive on a changing basis. And so with that idea, you might choose to one day get rid of the gas tax and replace it with this type of charge, where someone who's driving down the DVP at 8 a.m. in congestion would pay more than someone who's driving on a country road at 2 a.m. And you could funnel some of those extra dollars into providing investments in transit, which would, again, help to further decongest the roads.
You're a smart guy. You've looked at this for a long period of time. Answer the question for me, if you could. Why do we charge for transit and provide highways and roads for free?
It's a good question. You often end up with overuse of something as free, and I think that's the case with the road networks. People often view driving as a free, the trip is free, and so they choose to drive. There's always the thought of trying to recoup some of the investments and some of the operations costs, and so that's why we have the transit fares. There's always a desire to make the transit fare lower, and of course nobody wants to pay more. So I think getting to road pricing at some point in the future is a very complex task.
You talked about differential pricing for road pricing. I had Karen Stintz on, the former chair of the Toronto Transit Committee, and she said that one of the biggest innovations in transit that she was looking forward to was differential pricing during the day and over distance. So for an example, the Oyster card in London, England, it's the same card for any transit, and you don't pay with a different fare or something like that if you go from Mississauga to go to TTC to whatever else you might be using. It's one card, but what it does do is it charges you by distance, so that it's not one fare for all the distance. And then second of all, comparable to your comment about the DVP versus 2 a.m., differential pricing such that the highest prices if you would be taking the subway during the peak, and then lower pricing earlier in the morning or later on in the day. And then also one of the things that's interesting is that you reach a cap with the Oyster card, so that after you've taken like 8 to 10 trips, you don't get charged anymore. And so therefore it's really giving people that are on and off and on and off, an incentive to go on and off, to not have to go for a train. And I know this, where, if I'm downtown and I'm, going back and forth with a couple of meetings, after a while, you're going like, my God, I've just paid 5 TTC bills in one day.
Yeah, there's a number of themes in there. The capping is certainly helpful, especially for lower income residents. So, oftentimes that Metro Pass or other transit passes are great for someone who is transit captive and needs to use a lot of transit service, but they might not be able to afford to pay that fee up front. And so giving it in sort of a pay-as-you-go method where you cap at a certain point, okay, you use a lot of transit, you can use the rest of the month for free, is great for income equity, as well as just encouraging more transit use. Because if you hit that point and you are comparing your additional trips, and you're like, well, I could pay for parking, or I now have free transit for the rest of the month, you're much more likely to continue using transit service. Fare by distance, of course, is always an interesting topic. Ideally for me, I would like to see us get to a point one day where it's not sort of zone based, but you can actually pay by each kilometer, whether that's figuring it out via your mobile phone or some other system.
Well, we're chatting about transit tonight with Sanathan Kassiedass. San, a transit expert, smart guy, and has told us a lot about some of the innovation work that he was doing at Metrolinx. And we wish you well in the future, San. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Brian. Enjoyed chatting.
Thank you. So we're going to take a final break, and I'm going to come back with a couple of my thoughts on my own on transit. Stay with us. Well, that was an interesting conversation with San about sort of innovations in transit in the future. And I got to tell you, my own personal cut on this is a couple of things. First of all, I do think that whether it's shared vehicles or autonomous vehicles or something like that, that potentially is the solution to this last mile. And I used my example earlier in the show about my use of an Uber to get from my house to the train station. And one of the reasons why is, I'm not sure if this statistic was exactly right, but someone told me that GO Transit was spending more money on structured parking lots than they were on actual development of trains. And you've probably seen these massive structured parking lots they've been building, which seems like a little bit crazy that we build these huge parking lots, allow people to park for free just to get them on the train. And so clearly getting people to the train stops or the subway stops in a more efficient manner, I think is a key. I do think that autonomous vehicles are coming. I think they're coming faster than we otherwise might plan. You think about, how the internet's changed the world in so many different ways. I think autonomous vehicles are going to change the world, and I think we got to really think that through. I think it has the chance of completely changing the urban fabric the way that we talked about it. I think it makes transit less attractive. It makes highway driving maybe more attractive, which is a negative to San. And so therefore we got to think that through. But I do think that it ends up being a very efficient way for us to get around our cities. I think it makes our urban life and our suburban life far better with far less parking lots. But it means that we got to rethink how we get dropped off, how we get picked up, because our current system obviously can't change. You think about the CIBC building in downtown Toronto has 50,000 employees in it. Think about if 50,000 people were coming by way of each one of their own autonomous vehicles. They're not all going to get dropped off on Bay Street. So we got to think through exactly how that works, how that happens. And then I think that said, we're not going to all be able to take that autonomous vehicle. There's just not going to be enough room. And assuming that we figure out COVID-19 and the pandemic and physical distancing and public health on transit, the transit trains, subways, etc., are an incredibly efficient way of getting people to work. What we got to do is we got to figure out a way of getting this all day, two-way, frequent, and speedy and publicly health safe environments supplied to us. And we got to get that distribution throughout the Greater Toronto Area. I think the statistic was, I'm not sure if it still is, but 97% of all the people taking GO Transit were either going to or coming from Union Station. We don't have a network. If that's the statistic, what it is it's one point of connection. We need to create a network. And so I think that this Union Station West proposal by Pearson Airport is a good one. I think this idea of having a mid-Toronto train along the CP rail that goes through the Summerhill LCBO and the Castellone was a great idea. I think that this Ontario line that may be sort of taking people underneath Queen Street or King Street from the Science Centre Ontario Place is a good idea, but creating more of a network and less of a one point of contact, which is sort of like the spoke and wheel, is probably the solution that we need. Anyway, lots of interesting ideas. As I mentioned earlier, I'm chair of Transit Alliance, a civic advocacy organization. San came attended and spoke at some of our events, great guy. I encourage you to get involved, whether it be in Transit Alliance or any of your local organizations, because we're building our future, and let's build our future together and in the right way that will get us all to work, to play at sports, and to our families, to each other in the most efficient, safe, and publicly safe manner. Thanks for joining us. That's the Brian Crombie Radio Hour for tonight. Good night. Thanks, San.
Thanks, Brian.
Good night.